Green is the color most known for big imposing creatures and least known for creature removal. Unfortunately for all the Timmys in the audience, it was also very underpowered for most of Magic's history. As a result, a lot of green cards, especially from the early days of the game, are almost hilariously bad. Today, we're going to be counting down some of the worst green cards Wizards has ever rolled out. And starting us off at number 10, we have Argothian Wurm. This is a 6/6 worm for 3 and 1 green with trample, meaning it does excess combat damage to defending player, which is a pretty good starting point for a card. Unfortunately, it also has the ability where, whenever it enters, your opponent may sacrifice a land. And if they do, you put the worm on top of your library. A 6/6 with trample for 4 mana is still a pretty good stat line even in the modern day, so it was very imposing in the early days of Magic. To balance out the stat line, Worm can easily die to its own enter the battlefield trigger. Sure, sacrificing a land is a big cost, and something your opponent wouldn't want to do very often, but it's nowhere near as bad as hitting them with something like a Stone Ring. If your opponent already has a good board state and isn't waiting on extra land drops to play their cards, they can easily sacrifice a land to deny you a massive threat. Alternatively, if they have Doomblade waiting in their hand, they can just let it stick around and kill the worm. This is true of all creatures, but since Worm has removal stapled to it already, it's essentially never going to stick to the field. Your opponent will almost always either have removal or not want to be hung up for mana and be able to remove the worm, leaving you in a bad spot. Worm is essentially a Punisher card, and even the best versions of these effects like Risk Factor are much worse than they look at first glance. Worst of all, Worm puts itself back on top of your deck. So if your opponent sacks a land to get rid of it, you know you're drawing another Worm next turn that likely won't do anything. The best use case of Worm is probably using it as the top end of a Ponza deck alongside a ton of land destruction, so your opponent is even more discouraged to sacrifice their own lands. However, at that point, just about any threat will do the job. Worm isn't completely garbage all the time, but it's really bad most of the time, which is a lot worse than just casting a normal creature. And at number 9, we have Taste of Paradise. This is a sorcery for 3 and 1 green. It lets you pay 1 and 1 green any number of times as an additional cost to cast it, and it has the effect to gain you 3 life. Then you gain another 3 life for each time you pay the extra cost. Now, we haven't included too many life gain spells in this Worst of Each Color series yet, mostly because they're all bad for the same reasons and they're pretty boring to talk about. Taste of Paradise is just too hilariously bad on rate to not mention though. For 4 mana, enough that the card is instantly out of contention in a ton of formats, you gain as much life as a Healing Salve, a 1 mana instant that can also protect a creature from damage. Salve is also an unplayably bad card. Now, Taste of Paradise can scale into the late game, but even if you do pump a ton of extra mana into it, the life it gives you won't be relevant enough to be worth playing. At 6 mana, you're only getting 6 life, less than Angel's Mercy, and less than actually good cards like Nisa's Renewal that also ramps you. Even if you pay a massive 8 mana into the card, it will still gain you less life than Feed the Clan with a 4 power creature on field, a 2 mana instant. There's an endless number of life gain cards that do Taste of Paradise's job better, and an even higher number of cards that do this better that aren't life gain cards. Even the famously weak Fog is better at keeping you alive long enough to draw out of a bad hand and turn the game around. Again, there's not a lot to say about bad life gain cards. They're card disadvantage, and your opponent will usually just win the game of attrition if they're spending their mana on developing the board. Taste of Paradise is only here because it costs so much that it doesn't even help against burn, which is the only place life gain spells have ever found a meaningful niche. And at number 8, we have Mwonvuli Ooze. This is a 1/1 ooze with a mana cost of 1 green. It has cumulative upkeep too, meaning that at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter on ooze, then sacrifice it unless you pay the upkeep cost once for each age counter on the card. Finally, its power and toughness are equal to 1 plus twice the number of age counters on the ooze. Ah yes, the good old cumulative upkeep, one of the weirdest and worst mechanics Magic has ever rolled out. Cumulative upkeep by itself is enough to make almost any card with the mechanic bad. To see why, let's do some quick math. On the turn after you play Ooze, you have to pay 2 mana to keep it around. This ruins your mana curve, but could be worth it. The next turn, it's 4 mana, then 6, then 8, and after only 3 or 4 turns, you're up enough mana that you probably can't even pay to keep the Ooze around, let alone continue to develop your board alongside it. The cards with cumulative upkeep costs that I've seen play are cards like Mystic Remove and Elephant Grass, that have incredibly powerful game warping effects that you usually keep around for a few turns and try to use that brief window to take over the game. Unlike these cards, which can draw you a ton of cards or stop your opponent from attacking at all, Ooze is just a somewhat large vanilla creature. It can easily be chump blocked until you run out of mana to keep it around, and while it does grow quickly, you're still paying to make it that big. Unlike better cards like Hangerback Walker, which slowly grows every turn for only 1 mana, Ooze asks for as much mana as most creatures around the size would already cost. A lot of these gripes do apply to most cumulative upkeep creatures, but Ooze is still a lot worse than the other creatures in this category. Phyrexian Soulgorger is an 8/8 up front, which can be abused with cards like Fling, and other still bad cards like Phobia Phantasm at least don't scale as quickly. Ooze is small up front, asks for a ton of mana to stay around, and will need to be sacrificed very quickly. It's not that it can't do anything, it's just that it'll be on the board for far too little time to get the opportunity to have an impact. And at number 7, we have Hot Springs. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has Enchant Land and gives the enchanted land the ability where you can tap it to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to any target. Remember how I said that Healing Salve is a terrible card, despite being able to completely stop removal spells like Lightning Bolt? Well, Hot Springs is 1/3 of a Healing Salve each turn, which is just horrible. Now, you can use Hot Springs more than once, which does change the math a bit. Unfortunately, you don't really want to use Hot Springs over and over. The number of times this will save one of your creatures from combat or removal is very low. Not only because a creature dying from exact damage is rare, but also because your opponent can see the Hot Spring open and simply won't cast removal or make attacks it punishes. In the end, this means that the best use of Hot Springs is a very downgraded Maze of Ith, stopping you from taking 1 damage every turn when your opponent deals damage to you. Of course, this still isn't enough to make the card particularly good. However, this is essentially just worse than cards like Ajani's Mantra, which gains you 1 life a turn, because you won't get to use Hot Springs every single turn to pad your life total, and because you essentially have to use a mana every time you want to prevent damage. You can't tap a land for mana and activate Springs on the same turn, so you'd be wasting that mana if you use Hot Springs, which stops you from developing your board or doing anything that's actually useful. Hot Springs makes Taste of Paradise look like a good option against aggro decks, which tells you everything you need to know. And at number 6, we have Trailblazer. This is an instant for 2 and 2 green that makes it so that target creature can't be blocked this turn. There are multiple things that are strange about this card. It's one of a few instances that makes it so a creature can't be blocked, which is entirely pointless because the only time you'll be casting a spell like this is on your own turn. Technically, you can use it to target your opponent's creatures so they can hit another one of your opponents in a format like Commander, so it can be used for political purposes in that format. However, that's not really a consideration for this list, and even then, that's a pretty terrible use case. Onto what the card actually does do. Making a creature unblockable is a good effect, but somewhat worse than you might think. Simply put, it requires you to have a creature on the field already before the card can do anything, which is a big enough weakness to cripple a lot of cards. It's half the reason why auras are considered one of the weakest card types. Combat tricks generally suffer from the same curse. As a result, in order to see play, these cards have to have a very big impact on the game for relatively little mana. Cards like Titan Strength and Temur Battle Rage have found moments to shine thanks to giving their respective decks lethal pushes out of seemingly nowhere. Trailblazer can't do this thanks to the massive elephant in the room we haven't covered yet, its mana cost. Trailblazer costs the same amount of mana as Might of Oaks, which gives a creature a massive +7/+7 boost, and even that card is pretty underwhelming overall. Might of Oaks can be enough to end games if you're able to get a single creature through unblocked, which isn't that hard to do. While the effects are very different, Trailblazer will usually only let you hit for 3 or 4 damage that you wouldn't have done otherwise, less than most combat tricks we've mentioned so far. Most cards with this effect cost 1 to 2 mana, as well as having multiple other upsides depending on the card. We should stress that when we make these types of comparisons, it's not just to show the card is outclassed. It's to point out that that's how Wizards has to design cards with these effects for them to see play. The point is that the bar for a good card with this effect is so much higher than what Trailblazer reaches. You can make Trailblazer 1 mana and it would still pretty much be underwhelming. Spending your entire turn forward to make 1 card hit your opponent isn't just bad, it's bad enough to throw the game against a competent opponent. And at number 5, we have Mammoth Harness. This is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It has Enchant Creature in the abilities where Enchanted Creature loses flying. Whenever the enchanted creature blocks or becomes blocked by a creature, the other creatures gain first strike until end of turn. The point of Mammoth Harness is to debuff an opponent's creature to make it less of an issue in combat. Unfortunately, the card costs way too much mana and isn't even very good at hurting your opponent's creatures. 4 mana to straight up remove a creature is usually too much, and Harness doesn't even deal with the threat when you cast it. While giving your creature first strike is helpful, it won't really do that much. For one, if the creature has any useful abilities, they'll still be active. This is why cards like Claustrophobia, which are much more powerful than Harness, really don't see play outside of Limited. Simply stopping a creature like Gadok Teague from going to combat isn't all that important, and Harness suffers this same downside. Unfortunately, Harness isn't even good at keeping creatures out of combat. Sure, if they have something like a Windrake and you Mammoth Harness it, they can't attack into your Grizzly Bears anymore. However, they still have their creatures, and if you swing in with bears or your opponent finds some removal, they can start swinging in again for free. The issue is that your opponent controls when they attack or block, so they'll never let the creature die if they can help it. There are just too many situations in a game where even a heavily debuffed creature can get value for Harness to ever be worth it. It is worth keeping in mind that green is famous for being bad at dealing with opposing creatures. The only removal they get are effects like Prey Upon, that require one of your creatures to be able to kill an opponent's creature in combat to work. In a way, these modern day fight effects are like if Mammoth Harness wasn't terrible. It lets your creatures kill an opponent's creature, but requires you to have a creature with better stats and your opponent to profit, just like Harness. However, it actually removes the creature instead of asking your opponent to pretty please block one of your attacks so that your removal spell works. Fundamentally, asking your opponent to cooperate with you for your cards to even function is a bad idea. And at number 4, we have Shelkin Brownie. This is a 1/1 oof with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It is the ability where you can tap it to remove Bands with Other ability from target creature until end of turn. This is a creature we've talked about before, and for good reason. Before we get to what Bands with Others is, let's assume that you want to remove Bands with Others from your creatures, because even then you still wouldn't want to play Brownie. The issue is that there are no cards that natively have Bands with Others. Instead, there are 6 cards that give other cards the ability. First are Cycle of Lands that give Bands with Other legends to creatures of their respective colors. All these lands are unplayably bad, as playing a land that doesn't tap for mana and only gives very specific creatures extra abilities is pretty terrible. The last one is Master of the Hunt, the closest thing to a playable card with the ability. This is a 4 mana 2/2 that lets you pay 2 and 2 green to make a 1/1 Wolf of the Hunt token with Bands with Other creatures named Wolves of the Hunt. This is still quite bad, as it asks for too much mana for the stats, but at least it could have put in work on a stalled board state in Limited. Still, being a hate card for only 6 cards, 5 of which are actively bad and 1 of which is below average, leaves Shelkin Brownie in a bad spot. Unfortunately, Bands with Others is also such a weak keyword that even if it were common and on good cards, you wouldn't want to play Brownie. What Banding with Others does is allow any number of creatures of the given quality to attack or block as a band, as long as one of them has the ability. Bands are blocked together, and whenever a band is blocked or blocks, you choose how your opponent's creature's damage is divided, instead of its controller. Banding is generally considered one of the weakest abilities in the game, or at least it was until it was quickly discontinued. Now, not to name names here, but I have seen some murmurs in the comments that banding is actually being underrated in these videos. Essentially, there are concerns that banding is actually much better on defense than offense. If your opponent attacks into an open board, you can block with 1 large creature and 1 small creature with banding, then put all the damage from your opponent's creature onto your small banding creature. Then kill it with your larger threat while only losing your small creature. While this is true, it's not likely to come up. You would need a creature that could kill your opponent in combat, but wouldn't survive combat with it, and for your opponent to attack knowing all of this and not caring. This will mostly just dissuade a few attacks from your opponent, but even then, they can easily get around it with removal or by swarming the board with more creatures. The issue is that banding won't really ever open up good attacks for you, which is the most important thing for a combat ability to do. So banding is better on defense than on offense, but it's still not a good ability. It's also still not a good enough ability to play Brownie specifically to remove it from other creatures. The only real saving grace of Brownie is that it's a 1/1 body, so it at least sort of adds to your board, even if its ability doesn't do anything. And at number 3, we have Cocoon. This is an ore enchantment with the mana cost of 1 green. It has enchant creature you control. When it enters the field, you tap Enchanted Creature and put 3 pupa counters on Cocoon. As long as one of those pupa counters are in Cocoon, the Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during your untap step, and during your upkeep you remove a pupa counter from Cocoon. If you can't, you instead sacrifice Cocoon and put a +1/+1 counter on the creature, and it gains flying permanently. So this aura requires you to wait 4 turns because it triggers when you can't remove a counter, not when it last is removed, and all it gives you is +1/+1 in flying, and it stops you from using your creature at all until then. In case you're wondering, yes, there is a card that gives all the same benefits without any of these downsides, Arcane Flight. And while it's in blue, that's not an excuse for essentially being a removal spell for your own card. In fact, there are removal spells that work exactly like this. Heliod's Punishment is an aura for 1/1 white that prevents a creature from attacking and blocking until it taps 4 times to remove all task counters from punishment. The only difference is that you don't get the counters and flying, but that's not worth the cost of waiting 4 turns. It's a pretty big tale the designers made sure you couldn't put Cocoon on your opponent's cards, because otherwise the card would have been a pretty good removal spell. Who cares if the creature is better 4 turns later? Your opponent is probably already dead by then. Somehow Cocoon isn't even the only card that works like this. Cycle of Life is an enchantment that costs 1 and 2 green. You can bounce it back to your hand to turn target creature that was cast this turn into a 0/1 until the next turn. During your next upkeep, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Cycle of Life is also quite bad, but it at least only debuffs your creature for 1 turn. However, since you can only use it on creatures you just played, you can't use it to buff up a creature more than once unless you cast Cycle of Life multiple times on 1 turn. This is all way too much work when you could just use a card like Snakeskin Veil, which also protects the creature at the same time. Wizards was really scared of the idea of infinite value at this point in Magic, so they made this card way worse than it needed to be. Still, the card is merely horribly inefficient and cumbersome, rather than an active detriment like Cocoon is, which is why it's only getting an honorable mention on this list. And at number 2, we have Splintering Wind. This is an enchantment for 2 and 2 green. It has the ability where you can pay 2 and 1 green to deal 1 damage to target creature, then you create a token with a ton of abilities. The token is a 1/1 that has flying and cumulative upkeep 1 green, which if you don't remember, means you have to pay more and more mana each turn to keep it around. Finally, when the creature leaves the field, it deals 1 damage to you and all of your creatures. This card is so close to being good, or at least playable. If it had 1 less downside, it would probably be worth playing. It is very expensive to get out and activate, asking for 7 mana to deal 1 damage. And the rate doesn't even start looking that good no matter how many times you activate the card. However, the token it makes you actively makes the card worse. The cumulative upkeep costs, like any costs, means that they will eventually die. You can't pay the costs into perpetuity after all. The fact that they cost mana means that you can't keep them around without sacrificing the ability to use Splinterwing's ability more. The real kicker comes in when the wind token dies, because they're taking you and everything else down with them. Once a single wind token dies, it will deal 1 damage to all the other tokens, which will then die and trigger as well. Not only will you take damage, but this will also deal damage to your board, so all your other creatures have a good chance of dying as well. It does depend on how many tokens you have, and threats like Polokranos have a good chance of sticking around, but anything cheap is likely to die. All of this makes doing anything with wind almost impossible. If you activate it a lot in 1 turn, you'll either have to stop using it and cast other spells to keep the tokens alive, or just let them go and lose life and possibly your board. If you don't activate it a ton, then you're paying 4 mana to play an enchantment that effectively does nothing. If the tokens didn't have the upkeep cost or only dealt damage to you when they died, the card would probably be playable. But since they take everything hostage and demand a frankly unreasonable price, there's no way to get around their demands. Unfortunately, there's one card that's still worse than Splintering Wind, and it's probably the one you're thinking of. And at number 1, we have Wood Elemental. This is an elemental with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. As it enters the field, you sacrifice any number of untapped forests. Its power and toughness become the number of forests you sacrifice. We're finally at the most famously terrible card green has to offer, and it's easy to see where Wood Elemental gets its reputation. For one, sacrificing lands to determine the size of your creature is a terrible ability up front. What you'd want to do is make the creature as large as possible to push through more damage, which would require you sacrificing a ton of lands. This puts you in a precarious situation, where you're often giving up your ability to cast additional spells just to get a threat in play. If your opponent has any interaction for the elemental, this can lose you the game on the spot. And yes, dies to Doomblade isn't a great argument against threats, but when getting hit by Doomblade means you lose the game, it's a lot more relevant. To make this ability playable, Wood Elemental would need to have stats equal to double the forest you sacrificed or something similar. At least let it have haste so it can get in for damage right away. However, Wood Elemental goes above and beyond in terms of being garbage, because it requires the lands you sacrifice to be untapped. This means that you can't tap those lands for mana the turn you use them, which means that Wood Elemental will be the only thing you're doing the turn you cast it. Unless you don't sacrifice all your forest to the elemental, which you're not going to do often because being a huge body is all the card is good for. Essentially, you have to spend your entire turn playing a mediocre creature that also puts you behind on mana for the rest of the game, which is as terrible as it sounds. Elemental is another card that's puzzling in terms of its design. No one in their right mind would think a creature that eats your lands to set its stats would need extra downsides. But Wizards thought that letting the player do anything in addition to playing one of the worst creatures in the game was simply too powerful. There's a reason Wood Elemental has become a meme in the community. The card looks like it's tailor-made to be awful in every imaginable way. It's hard to imagine that any green card will ever be worse than Wood Elemental. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other worse green cards we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.